Megan. How are you?
I'm well, thanks, Noam. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm happy to be back doing this, even if I'm just catching the tail end of the blogging heads era here.
Yes, well, it is a sad day.
So why don't we tell people who we are? I'm Noam Scheiber. I'm a staff writer at the New Republic, and I'm just coming back from book leave. So I've been out of it for a long time, but I'm back just in time for the end of the Republican primary campaign and hopefully the beginning of an exciting presidential campaign.
And I'm Megan McArdle. I'm an associate editor at The Atlantic, and I am not very excited for the presidential campaigin, and luckily I'm going on book leave for the first part of it. So
there you go. You picked the right time.
Yes. Back in June. But anyway, I guess we're here talking today about the exciting news of the day. We've got North Korea payroll tax cut and all sorts of other things. A less than quiet Christmas week. But you want to talk about payroll tax cuts, so maybe you should lead off.
Yeah, so, I mean, the thing that is interesting to me about this is it appears to me that Democrats, having had what looked like a decent amount of leverage going into this, have maneuvered themselves into a potentially really bad position. Now, I say potentially because it could work out fine for them. We're in this weird moment where we're filming this before the House is going to vote on something that could just make me look like a complete idiot. But so I will couch everything with caveats and conditional statements. But basically what had happened was, back at the end of last year, the Democrats and Republicans agreed to cut the payroll tax by 2 percentage points from that employees pay from 6.2% to 4.2%. It's worth about $100 billion. This past year would be worth about the same next year if they extended it. But that's the question: are they going to extend it? It expires on December 31st. So going into last week, the Democrats basically had their tactic was to say, we want you, the Republican Party, to do this, and until you agree to do this, we're not going to sign off on the appropriations bills that fund the government through the end of the 2012 fiscal year. And so that was their big bargaining chip, because everyone seemed to think the GOP would be blamed for a government shutdown if it happened, and the GOP seemed to think that too. So everyone seemed to recognize this as a bargaining chip. Then I guess it was Friday night, just before the deadline hit, which would have required a government shutdown if they hadn't done this spending deal. The Democrats sort of withdrew that bargaining chip and said, okay, well, we're going to sign off on this spending bill for 2012. And in exchange, we've worked out this deal in the Senate, and the deal is we'll extend the payroll tax cut for 2 months. So instead of expiring on December 31st, it would just expire on February 29th, I guess. Next year is a leap year. Or March 1st instead of January 1st. And so they seem to think that was a good deal. And what they got was this 2-month extension of the payroll tax cut. What they were giving up was this expedited decision on the Keystone pipeline from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico, which a portion of the Democratic base doesn't like. Environmental activists are up in arms about it. And so that would put pressure on Obama to have to decide that a lot sooner rather than be able to kick it past the 2012 election. But I think the Democratic calculation was if this thing gets extended 2 months, the payroll tax cut, there's no way in the world that Republicans would at that point be willing to let it expire. And if they did, even better, right? They just slap them around for the next 7, to 8 months, whatever it is, before the election, and accuse them of allowing taxes to rise on the middle class. So I think they liked this deal. They thought, the politics work out for them, and that's why they were willing to give up this bargaining chip they had on the 2012 spending bill. But the wrench that was thrown into this was the House. John Boehner's House GOP caucus said, no way, no deal. And so the House was actually in a reasonably good position, I think, to say this, because they had already passed a year-long extension of the payroll tax cut, which is what the president claimed that he wanted, and I think he did want. And the catch on the House bill was that they extended, or they required this pipeline decision to go ahead as well. And so now we're in this weird moment where the Senate passed this 2-month deal that Democrats thought was a good deal for them, kind of substantively and politically. The House kind of said, no way. We've already passed a bill that does what the president said he wanted to do, which is extend this for a year. And we're just kind of in a stalemate. And I guess what's going to happen is it looks like the House is going to vote down the Senate compromise, and then we're just going to have a kind of PR campaign over who's to blame for this potentially expiring. And I suspect in the course of that back and forth there will be some deal reached. And the question is it the deal that looks more like the deal that the Senate did, which Democrats appear to be very happy with, or does it look more like the House deal, which extends it for a year but also forces this pipeline decision on the president? And my feeling about this is one of these strange anomalous moments where the GOP actually has the right policy argument and the right political argument. The political argument is, well, we passed this thing for a year, they passed it for 2 months, and the only thing holding this up is this pipeline thing, which I think most people probably read as also a plus for jobs, right? So it's a hard argument to make on economic grounds that they're in the wrong spot. And the policy argument is like, well, of course, if you're going to extend something, you should for a year, you should extend it for a year, not for 2 months and then 10 months, right?
Right.
So I think the House is actually, this is rare for me to say, but I think the House GOP, both on policy grounds. Now, I don't like the pipeline decision, but I'm just saying on kind of pure economic grounds, pure sort of job-creating policy grounds. I think they're in the right place substantively and the right place politically. And I'm sorry that was such a convoluted summary of where we are, but the whole back and forth has been convoluted. But the bottom line is I think they kind of, even though this was driven by people who are supposed to be kind of irrational, pitchfork-wielding Tea Party types, I think this got them to like the right place politically and substantively.
Well, I have to say, I mean, there's so much going on here that's complicated. And, like the Keystone thing, I actually just think is kind of stupid. Whatever you think of needs to be done about global warming and so forth. And I assume that you and I are probably pretty close to the same page in terms of what we would like to see done with carbon taxes. And, maybe cap and trade is second best and suboptimal, but maybe better than nothing. And the Keystone Pipeline is not going to stop anything. It's not going to stop one barrel of oil from being pumped. It's just going to go through Canada to a port if it doesn't go to us. And it may indeed end up being refined and sold in a dirtier process if it gets shipped to, say, China.
I think that's the concern, yeah.
So the environmental argument against this is just pointless. It's symbolic. It is not going to have any effects on reducing global warming. It might cost the United States some money, so I tend to, in fact, side with the Republicans on this one, even though in my ideal world, maybe a carbon tax would make that kind of oil not profitable to pump, right? But in my second ideal world, I think they should just drop the damn pipeline, and I think that the environmentalists, picking this hill to die on, especially right now, the environmental lobby's ability to shoot itself in the foot over and over and over again when North Dakota is the only region in the United States that is doing okay, taking a stand against oil pipelines is just you are doing so much more damage than you could possibly be making up by, having an effect on the environment at this point, right? So that, bracket that. I'm kind of 2 minds because I completely agree with you. If you were going to do a payroll tax cut, you should do it for a year. In part because no one, a payroll tax cut for 2 months is going to help nothing. If you think it's stimulative, unless you just happen to want to sort of give money to people, right, at the cost of a larger budget deficit, it's not going to be stimulative because it's 2 months. The amount of money it's going to put in people's hands is small, but also the uncertainty, right? You can have arguments over how much people pay attention to temporary versus permanent. But I'm pretty sure that, if you tell people that there's a 2-month payroll tax cut and then it's going to go back into force, they're going to save a bunch of it. And my understanding is that's basically what they found with George Bush's temporary tax rebates, is that when you framed it that way, they just saved it and didn't spend as much of it. So that's and also because I'm kind of hawkish and I am worried about the deficit, And I totally understand and in theory agree with all of these arguments about, well, we should be doing stimulus now, saving later. I think that in an ideal world would be true, but I'm not sure we live in an ideal world. And when I watch the way that both parties are kind of amping up the use of these veto points, the fact, I thought all of the Bush tax cuts should have been allowed to expire in 2010, even though, yes, it would have been worse for the economy, et cetera. But, when are they going to expire? The longer they go on, the harder it's going to be. They should have been allowed to expire. And similarly, the longer this goes on, the harder it's going to be to start taking $1,000 out of people's paychecks every year. And so that's dangerous. It's dangerous on multiple levels. First of all, the argument the Democrats have always had when Republicans say, well, people on the bottom half of the distribution pay no income tax, is that, well, in fact, they pay the payroll tax, and it's quite regressive, right? Well, if you actually end up sort of accidentally abolishing the payroll tax, it will actually be true that people at the bottom of the distribution will be paying nothing for the government at all. In the bottom half, we're not talking about people in the bottom 1% or 10% or whatever should in fact be paying nothing to support the government. Although I think you could talk about structuring of benefits, so there's some marginal cost for voting for new spending, but they shouldn't be covering the cost of our government. But people in the bottom half, when you have more than half of the country who's not paying any tax at all, that is a problem. That is a public choice problem that is going to create giant creaking massive fiscal problems coming down the road, because those people are just going to keep voting for stuff and the top half is going to get more and more aggressive about tax evasion, and then you end up looking more like Italy. So I think the payroll tax, as good as it might be for stimulus, at this point, watching how hard it is to get anything done, I just want to let it die. I want to go back to where we were with the Bush tax, before the Bush tax cuts, before the payroll tax cut, and even if it's a small economic hit. And I do understand with Europe, if we have to do stimulus, let's do it in some different way, because this is getting ridiculous. This playing with the tax code has gotten to the point where the thing makes no sense, and there is clearly no ability to sort of think about it in any rational way at all. So I at this point, I'm not supporting any tax cuts of any kind, no matter how good they might be for the economy.
So I have, it's funny because I agree with you. The ideal policy would be sort of stimulate now and consolidate 10 years from now, or, beginning in 5 years, in years 5, 6 through 10 or something. But I take the I conclude the opposite, that, if both things aren't possible, I want to stimulate now and I'll worry about the fiscal consolidation in a couple of years. Because, one, I think, the unemployment problem is an actual problem, and the kind of fiscal crisis is a hypothetical problem. And I think they're both, potentially, they're roughly equal, magnitude. Not exactly, but they're both serious problems. I prefer to deal with the real one than the hypothetical one. The second thing is, I think, the kind of intermediate term fiscal consolidation gets a lot easier. If you've grown, 4% and unemployment has dropped 2 percentage points in the 2 or 3 years before you try to do it, rather than trying to do it, while the economy is still incredibly fragile and unemployment is really high. So I do feel like a lot of this kind of intermediate term deficit conversation has been a little, I wouldn't say pointless, but it's not the greatest or smartest exercise in the world, just because if you could, get back to a better growth path, the entire conversation just gets a lot easier. I mean, if you go back to 97 when Clinton and the Republican Congress struck their balanced budget agreement, that was made incredibly easy by the fact that the economy was growing really well. They in 97 agreed to balance the budget in 5 years, and the budget was balanced the next year just because the economy did all the work for them. So I much prefer to have these deficit cutting conversations in a world where the economy is doing most of the heavy lifting for you, rather than a world where it's incredibly austere, on laying really tough austerity on top of a really fragile economy. I think that can just be largely self-defeating. So I agree with the ideal, the Platonic ideal, but I just kind of take a different conclusion. And then the other thing I would say about temporary tax cuts, I agree with you generally about the problem. I agree, I've looked at the same data about the Bush taxes. I think this is slightly different. One, because you're hoping to hit basically a lot of liquidity constrained people who just don't have enough money to make ends meet, and they're just going to spend it as they get it. And two, I also agree with you about kind of getting into this this kind of steady erosion of the payroll tax cut. I'm just not as worried about. I think it's a much longer slope from here to Italy than extending the payroll tax cut for a year. And this is an interesting question. I think my sense is, and this is not. My book is about the Obama administration economic team, and so I've been steeped in these conversations for a while. This is one thing I didn't report on a lot in the book, and maybe I will try as the campaign goes on. But you asked, my gut feeling would be Obama really, Obama in his heart of hearts, I think, would want to let all the Bush tax cuts expire on January 1st, 2013, when the latest deal runs out. And I think probably get rid of the payroll tax cut as soon as the economy is kind of, the recovery is sort of self-sustaining. So I think in his heart of hearts, that's where he's going. And I suspect if he wins the second term and, the political constraints relax a bit, I think, it wouldn't shock me if he did that.
Well, okay, so I think there's a lot in there. The first thing I would say just about the sort of the growth stuff, again, like I agree with you with an if, which is to what extent do we think that stimulating now is actually going to make GDP higher 5 years from now? And I'm not sure. I mean, I think there's kind of two competing theories of stimulus, and one is it's kind of like a cardiac pacemaker, right? Where not a defibrillator, where it actually jolts you back to life. You were dead, and now you're like on a permanently higher growth path. And there's another one where it's just like a pacemaker, right? Like it keeps you, it changes, so you get more growth now and less growth later. And I tend to take that as the more likely scenario. So I think that if we're stimulating now, that means that actually in 5 years when we consolidate, that probably means we're having slightly lower growth because we need to raise taxes to pay for this, and we've got a higher debt load and so forth. The caveat to that is, and you talked about this, is unemployment. And I do really take seriously the possibility that you're kind of contracting the production possibility frontier when you have a lot of long-term unemployment. Right. And that human capital actually just depreciates really fast. Yep. And the longer you're out of work, the more it's depreciating. And so I think that's a real, and if I thought that this stimulus was having the payroll tax cut was having a big impact on unemployment, I would support it. But a couple things. We're not hitting the most liquidity constrained households with a payroll tax cut because those are the households that are unemployed. And this is doing nothing for them. And so we're not helping the worst off people. We're helping people who are still employed with this, which is not like, people are struggling, they don't have as much overtime, but it's different. It's also helping people who have, quite a lot of money. The payroll tax cut goes to everyone. Yeah, no, I agree.
Right? I mean, if there are a way to...
so that's part of it. And then do we think that these people are spending and boosting employment for people who would otherwise be out of work long term? And the answer is, I really don't know, because if you kind of look at what happens when the stimulus ends and you look at where unemployment is, you can kind of draw a pretty strong trend line where we temporarily deviated and then we went back to that trend, and it looks like it gave us, a couple 10, 20 basis points off the unemployment rate, maybe 30. It's not that much. It's a lot of people still, but it's very small for a policy outcome. I would way rather see us do something on the spending side. Maybe we can't. This is obviously, we're always second best, third best, eighth best. I would if you told me that you wanted to come and double the cash value of unemployment benefits, I would say do it, go, right? Temporarily double the cash value of unemployment benefits. I would be totally in favor of that. But I think that politics of taxes in this country are so toxic that I'm just not sure. I really, really do worry that we are creating a very non-hypothetical, because as Carmen Reinhart, and I'm sure you've talked to her too, because everyone.
I know her.
Yeah, well, she's hilarious in person. She always says the same thing, which is a couple months before everything went to hell, Ireland was trading at a 20 discount point basis to Germany, and then all of a sudden it was a 300 basis point discount to Germany. And these things can move really, really fast. And so this is the constant problem. It's always hypothetical right up to the point where you're having a complete disaster.
Sure.
And when is that? I have no idea. It's just the euro wasn't in trouble until it was. Right now we're the safe harbor, and that's great. But how long are we the safe harbor for? I think in this environment, anyone who says they know is like crazy, because everyone is so terrified and so volatile and pulling all their money out everywhere. So I totally see what you're saying, and I think we're probably at a point of disagreement where you're like, I don't think you're crazy, and I'm like, I don't think you're crazy, and we're shaving a very fine line and coming out of it.
It's true, though. I still think you're crazy.
Oh, okay. Well.
Just kidding. Well, maybe we should move on then. I mean, since we hit on Europe a bit and on just the general shape of the economy, what's your sense? The job market has, if you look at weekly unemployment claims in the last couple of jobs reports, it's there's been some gradual improvement there. There's this there's this divergence between the household survey and the establishment survey that a lot of labor nerds seize on constantly, and they're certainly diverging now. So we don't entirely know what to make of the data, but it does seem directionally good, right?
It seems directionally good and directionally not good.
Okay.
So I'm really I'm not. It's sad if someone loses their job for 3 months and they have to take a job that pays 10% less, right? I feel bad for those people.
Yes.
If it, and 3 months later, but I don't feel that bad for those people. It's a bad thing to happen. The people I really worry about, though, are the people who had to work for 2 years. Because those people are devastated. Everything in their world, socially, their depression rates spike up, their marriages suffer, everything suffers. And the longer you're out of work, the harder it is to find a job that pays anything close to what you used to make. And I actually went through this. I was laid off by a consulting firm in 2001. And I didn't find a real long-term permanent job until 2 years later. And so I sort of have a visceral, feeling about this, which may bias my thinking, but I do think it's a really important issue. And when you look at, so what you see is the unemployment rate taking down, but you also see labor force participation taking down. And the assumption is, we don't really know, but the assumption is that those people are leaving the workforce because they just couldn't find a job and they gave up. And that terrifies me. And what is going to happen? The last time we really went through this was the Great Depression, and the unemployment was much worse. But at the end of it, we have World War II, where anyone who can breathe and carry a tool bag can get a job, and you just basically rehabilitate all this labor. You have this huge reserve army of long-term unemployed people, as Marx used to talk about, and they all got turned into productive, hireable workers who, there's a dislocation when all the soldiers come home. Within 2 years, basically everyone's back to work, full employment at, below 5%. So what happens to these people this time? I certainly hope we're not going to have World War II. What are we going to do with them, Noam?
No, I agree. I mean, and, it's a great question. What'll be interesting to see is once the kind of psychology of the labor market turns a bit. So say, 3-4 months from now, it's kind of the kind of conventional wisdom just generally in the labor market is, things are heating up, companies are hiring, and the people start, the discouraged workers start coming back into the labor force. Depending on the rate at which they do that, and the relative rate of that to the rate at which payrolls are expanding, the unemployment rate really could shoot up, right? The flip side is they could be discouraged for a very long time, and the psychology could lag behind the actual improvement in the labor market, in which case it'd be a very gradual thing. But yeah, I think you're right. We just don't know. I think by most, if you ask most economists, if you factored in the discouraged workers or non-workers, actual unemployment rate would be closer to 11-12% or something. So.
I think 11. They said if the same number of people were looking for work today as in 2007, the unemployment rate would be 11%.
Yeah, so that's it's just a mind-blowing number, and as you say, these cycles are reinforcing, and the implications are social, not just economic. So I agree with you.
And there's been this big divergence, right? Because people, you've now got, you always had this to some extent, I think, but you now see this really stark, people come into the labor market, they either find a job almost immediately, or they're done, and they just don't. They don't leave. Right. They just get stuck, and then their benefits run out at 2 years, and then we don't know what happens to them.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's completely terrifying. I mean, that said, I mean, you do have to be somewhat encouraged that the weekly unemployment claims are really at kind of a 2.5-year low, and the payroll seem to be expanding. I mean, it's tough to know exactly what the trend line looks like after only a couple of months.
I'm going to be happy with any improvement. I just wish that I felt more confident that we weren't creating some lost generation of people. I think a lot of them are probably in their 50s, so it's not exactly a lost generation.
Yeah.
It's got to be really scary to be in your 50s and not have a big 10 years out from Social Security and not have a big nest egg. And I don't know how people are living. I really and then, of course, the dark horse is Europe. And maybe we should take a minute and just say, what are you thinking about Europe right now?
Europe doesn't inspire confidence. I mean, I think I have a couple of random disconnected thoughts, but I mean, one is maybe, this is one of these historical ironies, but you get Draghi in as the ECB president, and, the one thing, I don't know how you feel about this, but I'd like to see the EU buy Italian bonds. I think that would sort of be, the ECB buy Italian bonds. And, the one person who's least well-positioned to do that is this Italian guy who just took over the ECB, right? He's kind of established his hawkish bona fides with the Germans who are the ECB's overseers, and the country where he comes from is kind of the least confidence-inspiring of the major economies in the European Union or the Eurozone. And so the one thing that, kind of a lot of monetary economists would suggest would be really helpful, he really can't do.
Especially because you don't want it to look like, the ECB has this problem in general, is that you don't want it to look like, the complaint about previous ECB chairs was that they were doing everything at the behest of Germany and France. You don't want it to look like, oh, we've got an Italian in, and now he's going to help his country out. And then next, when there's a Belgian, Belgian bonds will be
spoils,
And that's a real risk that I think a lot of people aren't talking about, is that he's just very constrained in how much he can do to directly help Italy out when they're the big person that need help.
I think that's right. Though, someone pointed out to me recently that just in terms of bank liquidity, the ECB has been, increasingly aggressive, which is good. So on the kind of sovereign debt level, they've been a little slow, but on just the financial institutions themselves, they've kind of looked a little more like the Fed in the 2008 crisis.
Well, I'd actually be really interested to hear what you think, because there's sort of two stories about what's happening in Europe right now, and one is that it's just this incredible half-assed half measure where they're propping up the banking system and not addressing the sovereign debt problem. And then there's the stuff Sarkozy has been saying, basically saying, well, yeah, we're going to prop up the European banking system, then they're going to buy their own sovereign debt, and then we will have propped up the governments. And there seems to be I don't have any real opinion, I think, about which one of those stories is correct, but I would be curious to know whether you do.
Yeah, it is an interesting take. My sense is that, at first blush, I think there are probably two problems, not one problem that you could just, not one problem that's kind of that you could solve through just one of these, tools. They're clearly two problems, right? Because some of the sovereign issues are real fundamental. So just even if you could just buy the sovereign debt, that would buy you a little time, right? But it wouldn't necessarily solve it. But even that aside, I'm not convinced that just propping up banks and having banks buy a lot of debt. I'm not sure that, you could, one problem is obviously the banks already have a lot of dicey sovereign debt on their balance sheets, and it's not, you worry about just, having this thing work for 3 months and then it explode with even fuller force, 3 months later. So I don't know. It's a good question. I'd like to think that could work. My gut reaction is it seems a little too clean and easy for me.
So if you had to bet on if you had to do the over under, or say what's your probability that the EU still has all its members this time next year when someone's doing the end of year video roundup?
Yeah, this time next year, I would say 2/3 chance that that's true. In 5 years, probably less than 50%. And the reason why is this is actually. So I was talking to this guy, Liaquat Ahmed, who wrote The Lords of Finance, who's really sharp on this stuff.
Yes.
And he made, we often hear this like dichotomous proposition, like either the EU has to or the Eurozone has to sort of integrate further, or it disintegrates, and it's just calamitous if it disintegrates, right? Because there's just going to be a run on all the local banking systems and currency crises in each country. And his point was like, actually, no, the muddling through scenario could be helpful because the countries that are exiting could just take a year or 2 or 3 and kind of ring fence their financial system and put either explicitly or implicitly put capital controls on the capital in the country, and by the time you wake up 3 years when Greece wants to disentangle itself, basically like that run can't really happen because they sort of locked it down. Maybe that's easier said than done because maybe once they start doing it even subtly and implicitly, the capital starts to run. I don't know.
But I feel like Greece is already having a huge bank run, right?
Yeah, maybe Greece is not the right example, but whatever, Spain or Portugal or so. His point was just that you could, the muddling through option may give you time to ring fence the financial system, and which is obviously what everyone's worried about if the euro comes apart or these countries exit. And so the exit could be a lot cleaner and less calamitous than people kind of reflexively assume.
Well, I think that one issue, though, is something that, you can look at Argentina, which has basically done this, right? They took themselves off a dollar peg, locked everything down, shut the banks. You couldn't take your money out. But Argentina has a border. And so one of the problems that you have, and they still, I don't know if you've seen just recently, they cracked down on dollar deposits, on the amount of cash. Italy is now doing this too. So maybe Italy is starting this. Italy has just cracked down on the amount of cash people could hold, allegedly as a way to crack down on tax evasion. And this is what Argentina also says about cash withdrawals, that it's for tax evasion. What it's really about is people physically carrying currency out of the country in order to move it. And to limit, because what Argentina likes to do is allow, they open up, and then as soon as you open up and you allow dollar deposits or whatever, then they crack down and they take some of your money. And that's how they've had to deal with the fact that they still have basically some, but very limited access to capital markets because they treated creditors so badly the last time around. And the guy who did it, his wife is president. So the problem is that European countries don't have borders, right? So if you have euro deposits, I guess you have to just stop people from being able to access their money at all. Because if you let them access it, they will remove it from the country. So you can't do what Argentina, what you can theoretically think of someone doing is you announce a capital control, and then 5 months later, right? And because there's borders, it's actually very hard to carry huge bags of currency or even checks out of a country because the banks won't honor the checks. So it has to be physical currency. The problem is you take out your euros in Spain in advance of it, then you just drive them right over to a country where those are legal tender and you deposit them. And there's no way to stop that because there's no borders within the EU. So I don't know what you...
So we're back to calamitous disentanglement.
We're back to calamitous disentanglement, I think. You have to announce, you have to redenominate instantly and shut down people's access to their bank accounts. And at that moment, all hell breaks loose.
Yeah. Okay, well, I would say this: if there's a way to do it without the calamity, I would say the probability is obviously higher, which is somewhat ironic because it then just makes it more likely, and you get a kind of run on not just a country level, but on the whole European project.
The caveat on that should be that Liaquat Ahmed is 100 times smarter than me and has probably spent a lot more time thinking about how you would do this, so he may have some plan.
He definitely spent a lot of time doing this, and I have to confess, I did not sort of press him on the details. The conversation was a sort of 5,000 to 10,000 foot altitude level, And I think he's a super smart guy too. So I kind of deferred to his knowledge of how the particulars might work. But you're right. I mean, it's just the kind of ordering of what you do is hard, right?
Right. It has to be very, very carefully done in a way that I think is harder than it used to
hard.
be.
Yeah. So let's shift. I mean, another thing we hate when we're in the unemployment conversation is something that you've been writing about a bit, which is just poverty and the culture of poverty. What? Give us your kind of 2-minute riff on poverty and what you've been thinking about.
So my 2-minute riff is that this is this issue that kind of divides liberals and conservatives quite a lot, because liberals, like I used to work for a nonprofit that provided temporary housing for homeless people. And I remember going to a homelessness awareness seminar. I'm not making this up. We had to go to a day-long thing. It was run by some very nice, well-meaning woman who I'm not sure had ever met any homeless people. She was like a professional trainer. And all the people all the directors who ran the actual facilities started just ripping into her. And I was shocked. They were all like, you know what my biggest problem is? I can't make them go look for jobs when their soap operas are on. And like, this is a real thing. And so like conservatives liberals kind of, not always, I mean, Jason DeParle, I think, is one of the best writers about poverty ever. And he cited something I wrote in a column the other day, and I was like, over the moon. And he's really good at this. Right, he's really good at showing you both why it's so hard to be poor and why poor people aren't just these like terrible lazy people who sit around and eat Cheetos while they watch television, and also the ways in which they do things that, like, in America, to survive, you have to have a bourgeois set of behaviors. To succeed economically, you have to have a bourgeois set of behaviors that they don't have, and so that from a middle class perspective, they shoot themselves in the foot over and over again. And conservatives are good about recognizing this, basically, but they're terrible about recognizing the ways in which, like, it's really, really hard when you're there to do something different. And in part, it's because you don't know anything else. In part, it's because, in fact, like, the things that make you survive on the street or survive in a housing project are also the exact same things that make it very hard to leave. And, like, one example, which is actually a slightly different example, because this guy was working and certainly not poor. But I mean, between the like upper middle class affluent people who write about poverty, there's this giant gulf. And I remember I worked with a bunch of construction workers, and one of them was, by all accounts, on his way to jail for murder. Or for possibly it was another state, and there might be a trial, and like. Basically what had happened was a friend of his had started a fight with someone else, and then this person was like pummeling his friend, and he had hit the other guy in the head with a bar in order to like get him off of his friend, and that guy had died. And it wasn't going to like first degree murder, but it was possibly going to be reckless homicide, manslaughter. Like, it was going to involve 8 to 10 years of jail time if he got convicted. And he was talking about it, and he was like, and what was really terrible was, like, my friend was being a total jerk and, like, had really was baiting this guy and got into this fight, and I felt really bad about it. And I was like, well, why the hell did you leap into the fight if your friend... And everyone looked at me like I'd just grown another head, right? They're like, you can't leave your friends.
Right.
Right, and, like,
a norm, yeah.
This is a big cultural shift, because, like, most upper middle class people, I think, whose friends were, like, mouthing off and getting into bar fights regularly, because this has apparently would like not have that person be your friend. Right. And they certainly wouldn't jump into the fight after your friend deliberately started a fight with some guy who was bigger than him. And like that, but the thing is, if you are in a violent environment, like that is actually the survival of the like upper middle class. Well, I'm only going to get into the fight if they're really good people and they have been unjustly attacked. Like, that is not a survival mechanism. That is a way to, like, get yourself killed. And, like, writ larger, right, poor people have almost no financial capital. What they have is an enormous amount of social capital. They have incredibly tight networks of, like, if you have something, you're supposed to share it with anyone who is part of your network and needs it. So if you have money and your brother-in-law's electricity got cut off, then you have to give him that money. The problem is, well, what if that was the money for your school tuition? Well, he needs it more. And that actually means that you survive, right? It means that if you need to eat, someone will make sure you eat. If you need somewhere to stay, someone will make sure you have somewhere to stay. But then it also means that it's very, very hard to A, do anything that offends that network, which can include trying to leave it. But it means in Jason DeParle's great book, American Dream, he talks about at one point, one woman who was working has like a drug addict and 8 children, of which I think 3 are hers, living in her tiny apartment. Yeah. And of course, it is incredibly difficult to get to work in that environment. They're running out of food because the drug addict is stealing their food stamps and selling them in order to buy drugs. And she doesn't kick her out. Yeah. And or she it takes a really long time, long after the drug addict has sold their stuff, made it so that she misses work and and costs her money and all that. Like most middle class families just would tell you to hit the road.
Right.
And so getting out of that, it's not so much, it's like a bad equilibrium, right? Like you're stuck in this bad equilibrium where it's very hard to leave and it's also that, especially kids are just dumb, right? Kids maybe other people would, if they had been born in a housing project, they just would have studied their little butt off and gotten out. If I had been born in a housing project, I would have dropped out of high school because I really liked hanging out with my friends. I didn't like schoolwork. I didn't like working hard that much, right? So the fact that we thought that if you could just give poor people things that the middle class had, and the conservatives want to give them the things that middle class values, the middle class, right? They want to give them jobs and marriages, and liberals. And I'm exaggerating the divide here, right? But liberals want to give them the stuff that the middle class has, like houses and food budgets and so forth. And neither of them actually changes this dynamic all that much. Yeah. And that's
one thing that I thought I was trying. I mean, just getting back, kind of as you introduced you overlay the political debate on this. I mean, I thought it was interesting. You did a post about a woman who went from earning $25,000 a year to $35,000 a year.
Yeah.
And at $25,000 a year, her quality of life and her kind of take-home, income, including benefits, was not much higher, but significantly higher than it was at $35,000, just because there are a variety of programs, government-funded health insurance and child care that she qualified for at $25,000 and not at $35,000. And obviously, I think the term supply side is in the title of your blog post, and it's obviously very much a supply side, problem that supply siders have seized on, which is these huge discontinuities in the tax code and government benefits, and she basically. She gets a abrupt increase in her marginal tax rate when she goes from $25,000 to $35,000 a year. So much so that she's worse off. And what's interesting to me about that debate, because I remember hearing it a bit from the right during the healthcare debate. And some conservatives, I think Greg Mankiw made an argument about this, that just because of the discontinuities, you're creating these huge disincentives, for people to earn more. And to me, I always thought it was true, or often true. I can't speak to every instance in which a supply sider has raised this critique of, the government benefits. But B, the implication, I think, is weird. I think an empirically minded liberal who saw that would say, okay, yeah, that's bad. We should just phase these benefits in more gradually, so you don't get these huge disincentive. Right. And the conservatives would be like, well, we should just not have them, And that was always a weird response. It's okay, you've identified this problem in the way we administer these programs, but I don't see that as really a trump card against having the programs. We should just have the benefits phase out so that people don't face these huge leaps, these huge discontinuities. But it's always just been a strange thing that conservatives will sort of wield this as kind of a trump card in these conversations.
Well, and I feel like most of them don't, right? Greg Mankiw does, but I feel like actually this doesn't seem to be an issue that really engages a lot of supply side politicians, and I feel like especially politicians on both sides ignore it because it has uncomfortable implications for both sides, right? On the one hand, for a Democrat to be making this argument, you're arguing that high tax rates disincentivize work, which then makes it harder to turn around and say, except if you're rich. And then on the other
not
hand,
really. I mean, the argument is just that, like, abruptly, these discontinuous shifts at particular points in the income spectrum are bad. Which,
but
like, I think
they don't have to be over 100% for it to be problematic. And I don't think that
Yeah.
most of us. I think most of us think that if you tell a welfare mother, someone who's just gotten off welfare and is now making $20,000 a year, well, you could make $25,000 a year, and we're going to let you keep 1,000 of it, but you're going to have to work. It's farther away, and you're going to have to work an extra 2 hours. Like 5 hours a week. I think most of us understand that if we told her that she could work an extra 5 hours a week in order to get something like $20 a week, she wouldn't do it, right?
Yeah.
So that even if there were a 70% marginal tax rate is probably a pretty solid disincentive to work.
That's true, but the debate that plays out outside of this context is not a 70%. It's from going from like 35 to 39, right? Like as it plays out on a broader political scale, it's a very, very marginal.
Right, but then you have to have this argument about it, right? Like you have to have an argument about at what rate it happens, and there's right. And that's not how politicians argue. Politicians argue in incredibly broad strokes. They argue about like.
I agree, but that's no reason why
either they do or
commentators
they don't.
who adjudicate the debate should have to argue in those broad strokes too. I mean, I'm perfectly comfortable saying yes, 70, 80, 90, or 100% marginal tax rate is bad. We should try to avoid situations where we force people to face that.
Piketty and Sayas
going
are
from 35
advocating
to 39% is it's ridiculous that people would think that that creates a huge disincentive to do additional work.
But Piketty and Sayas are last I looked, were advocating a 70% marginal tax rate on top earners. So I mean that is out there as a serious like wonk number. It's not just kind of some imaginary. And maybe it's only on very high earners or whatever. But that was, as I recall, the implication of their last paper was that. That 70% you would get like better utility and you wouldn't get much work disincentive, et cetera. And I find that hard to believe. Yes, I think if you're like Warren Buffett, that's true. But a lot of people who make a lot of money are like, they own a chain of 7-Elevens. It's not like super awesome rewarding work where you just get up and you're like, yes, I made the 7-Elevens safe for America, America safe for 7-Elevens or whatever. It's just, they do it to make money. And they like being rich and they like being richer. And there's a lot of people in that category who make $750,000 a year by doing something that a lot of us wouldn't recognize as particularly like psychically rewarding work. They're running small firms that don't do anything sexy, and they spend a lot of their time arguing with suppliers about tiny differences in grades of tin or whatever. Anyway, back to like so I think that was, it's just, it has fallen off the radar. And I think that's wise, that it doesn't tell, right? Like for conservatives, instead of saying poor people, really need to get off their ass and have lower benefits, you're saying, well, they've got this really high tax rate and we've structured it. I also think that the big problem that you see when you look at these numbers isn't the phase out of any particular program, it's they all phase out at the same place,
right.
And they're different.
I think that's right, yeah.
Right? So like, and because there's a lot of them that are just cutoffs, right? Like Medicaid is you're on or you're off. It's not like you have higher Medicaid copays. And that's a big one. But it's also, so the cash benefits and food stamps actually phase out pretty gradually. Mm-hmm. But then things like Section 8 vouchers like just contain an embedded 30% marginal tax rate, because that is, it always goes up by 30% of whatever your new income is until it phases out entirely. But a lot of things like subsidized childcare and subsidized, home care, like all of that stuff just cuts off. It's not phased. Right. And that means that there is 100% tax rate on like that kind of amount of income or close to. But it's because there's so many of them. If it were one thing, if it were just Medicaid, she could have dealt with it. If it were but she also lost her subsidized childcare. She also had a longer commute. She also had it was everything all hitting in basically this same $10,000 income range. But the problem is, right, we can argue about whether we could, we're not going to provide the EITC to everyone. I think we can agree on that, right? It's not like middle class people can have the EITC. We can't give everyone back, 60% of their income or whatever it is that the EITC boost now is. And also things like Medicaid, et cetera, have to phase out. Someone has to start paying for these benefits at some point. Which means that there's always going to be, and for things like subsidized childcare, et cetera, there's always going to be, unless we just handle it all through the tax system, even then with things like the EITC and with food stamps, we're not going to give friggin' food stamps to everyone in the country. That would be completely...
Yeah, look, I mean, I agree that these things have to phase out, but I think, 90% of the, I'm just pulling a number out of out of the air, but, clearly there's going to be someone who has some weird kind of marginal tax rate disincentive, but I think you could, substantially mitigate the problem, if you just phased it and you took into account things phasing out at the exact same time, same point in income.
But how do you, because it's so uncoordinated, right? Like each agency is setting its own guidelines.
Right.
And a lot of them are states or they're local. The problem isn't that, in theory, you couldn't design some comprehensive system that would have a much worse effect, but how do you take the fact that there's a patchwork of systems overseeing these?
Right. No, I agree.
And I don't know what the answer is, but it's something that I wish people would talk about more, and I don't feel like I ever see politicians talking about this. They have narratives. I think the left has narratives that don't involve people making choices, which is one of the things here, right? So the narrative about poverty is that no one chooses it. And the right doesn't have narratives about people having tax problems, right? That is not their narrative about the poor. And so you just kind of leave this out. And I think that's a big mistake because when you look at kind of the stickiness of that bottom quartile, I assume some of that is because of mental health and drug abuse and disability. But I think a lot of it is just is that there is this hurdle and it's so high. And the fact that anyone even tries to jump it is really kind of an amazing testament to human character.
The hurdle, you mean cultural hurdle?
No, the tax hurdle. Just the tax hurdle of or it's not, you can decide whether that hurdle of I am worse off or I am so little better off. There is this $10,000 to $15,000 income range where there is so little improvement in your earnings, even if it's positive, even if the number is positive, it's so slow. That why the hell would you even try? Why not just stay where you are?
I don't know. I mean, this is obviously an empirical question, and we're not going to resolve. My instinct is that it's smaller, but just if only because people like the woman that you read about are sort of not aware of it before it actually happens, and then it's often too late to do anything about it. But we should probably not try to resolve an empirical question just talking out of the seat of our pants. So we probably have time for maybe one more thing.
North Korea.
Sure, go for it. Give me your 2 cents on North Korea.
Well, I think that we don't know what's going to happen, obviously, and I'm certainly no expert on the political system. But I think the real open question is what happens if it has to reunify. North Korea, I was looking this up today, so just did an op-ed on it for the Daily. Their per capita GDP. So when Germany reunifies with when Western Germany reunifies with Eastern Germany, there's something like, its measurements are difficult, but there's something like a 30 to 35% difference in consumption. Maybe it's as high as 50%, maybe it's as low as 20%. It's about the difference in consumption between East and West, right? And this is places that had in 1937, 1939, basically equal GDP. Before World War II, it was actually slightly higher in the East. That's a big, huge project, and it's 20% of the population of unified Germany, and it costs Germany a fortune, and it's still not fixed. Unemployment is double in Eastern Germany what it is in Western Germany, even though huge numbers of Eastern Germans have moved in search of work. But compared to the task facing Korea, this is nothing. North Korea has a GDP of CIA World Factbook, $1,800 a year. South Korea has a GDP of $30,000 a year. This is 15 times higher. And it's a population of people who haven't had enough to eat literally since the Soviet Union collapsed. They haven't had, they've lost several million people to a famine. They don't have computers, cell phones, cars. They're, by all accounts, incredibly effectively actually propagandized. People were making fun of today all of these people kind of beating the ground in sorrow. Right. But I read this great book about North Korea, which is about accounts for defectors, and they say some of them were doing it cynically, but some of them were just genuinely thought when Kim Il-sung died, oh my God, what will we do now? Our country cannot survive, the world has ended. And that is, people talk about, the most heartbreaking story from this book was a woman goes foraging for food in China, and she sees a bowl of rice and meat on the ground. And she thinks, why is that on the ground? And then she hears a dog bark, and she realizes that like she hasn't seen rice or meat in years. And these are people who are going into the countryside, taking trees and stripping off the bark and chewing it, not because it is in any way nutritious, because it will fill their stomach. And she realizes that everything she has been told is just a complete lie, that she knows nothing about the world because she has been in this little hermetically sealed bubble.
Right.
And she was like a block leader in her building, and her husband had died in the famine, and I think one of her children had died too, maybe her only child had died in the famine, and this is incredibly just, that she suddenly, it's like someone told us today, like the law of gravity, it's a lie. Like it's been a big elaborate fake job by the United States. Gravity doesn't exist. Like this is all a facade, and like you're strapped into a machine and someone's projecting images on your eyeballs or something. And so that is like they really are in this bubble. How do you integrate that with a modern economy? With a society in which, like, to the extent that people even have jobs, they're drilled in like, don't ask questions. It's dangerous. Don't, you don't know how to use any technology. How do you put that? Their agrarian economy couldn't even compete with anything, right? Like if they were trying to compete on the world market, they would not sell anything. They have, as far as I know, no viable exports. So what do you do with 20 million people, give or take, in that condition? It would cost something like the annual GDP of South Korea to reunify.
Yeah, it's a daunting challenge. I mean, obviously, even assuming that before you even get there, there are hurdles, right? I mean,
but this is the best case scenario.
Right,
the worst case scenario is someone gets their hands on North Korean nukes. Right. Someone even crazier than Kim Il-jung.
Yeah, I mean, I thought, one of the interesting questions is that, Kim the third here has obviously been educated in Switzerland, and he cannot be more sort of sensitive to what's going on in the world, and his worldview, I suspect, is just far more open, and I don't mean that in a normative way. I mean there's just other stuff on his radar screen.
He has been outside of the country, yes.
Yeah, been outside of the country, and they're just sort of mores, and just by sheer osmosis, like you can't be a high school student in Switzerland with a bunch of other Western types and not, have some of that, soak some of that in. But it's, I think that, as I say, it's like a purely descriptive thing. As a normative proposition, I mean, there's the general problem of like having to prove your cred, right, with the military apparatchiks. But like, I mean, that certainly didn't work with like Bashar Assad, right? Like everything we heard about him before he took over from his father was like, oh, he's trained in England and he's an optometrist or and he's a man of science and he's empirical and he's modern and contemporary and that guy's been just like an even probably not an even bigger thug than his father, but a big thug, right? So it just. I think that it's sort of seductive to think along those lines, but probably neither here nor there.
Right. No, I was wondering about this as well, because like you can totally tell a story where he like understands that it's all a lie, but part of it is like I imagine myself being outside my country in another country, and I'm reading all these terrible things about my country, and I don't see it because you forget. When you read about Mao and so forth, you forget how little information he had because people hid it from them. Like, I am sure when Kim Jong-il or his son go and tour Korean villages, the Korean villages are filled with happy people who have way too much food, right? Because someone makes very sure that that's the case. And so when he hears this, like, he's been there and he's seen it, and it's not true. And it's a bunch of like mean foreigners who just talk bullshit about your country all the fucking time. And like, who the fuck do they think they are? And like, pardon my language, this is the end of an era on blogging heads. I'm going to go out swearing like a sailor apparently. No, but I think about I can totally tell a story where it radicalizes me, and it makes me even less willing to listen than my dad was. And I think one of the great stories actually about his older brother was originally the heir. And he was, he lost the heirdom apparently because he took a trip to Japanese Disneyland on a forged Chinese passport and he got caught.
Interesting.
And that was it. And I think it really says something kind of powerful about how they think about people who have interactions with outsiders. And it also suggests what this guy will have to do to prove himself, right, to the internal people in order to maintain the credibility to be leader. The best case scenario is that this all collapses kind of peacefully. The army refuses to shoot, and the way that they did in, like Egypt and so forth. And this is like functionally the problem in a lot of revolutions, is just that you're reliant on the army, and the army may just say no. And that's usually how most kind of successful popular uprisings happen. It's not that you always have the military force to defeat them. It's just that, like, at some point the army may say, "I won't fire." There's not a lot of evidence, but no one really knows. I think this is the weird thing. It's just like we're all kind of randomly speculating based on the 17 defectors who have come out and talked about what it's like.
That's right. If you thought our information in Iraq based on defectors was dodgy, like this is that to the end.
Exactly. Right. So I don't think we have any idea, and it's terrifying, right? Because they have nuclear weapons, and it's also so tragic. Like you read these books, especially, and I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's a great book. It's based on written by Barbara someone. It's written based on the interviews with 6 defectors. And it's just unbelievably tragic. You can't believe that people live through this terrible, terrible, endless suffering, and that they're still there. And that it's gotten a little bit better because unlike then, what happened in the 90s was that the food aid would go in and the military would steal it. And now the conditions have been put on, and weirdly, like the bags would end up in Chinese market, in the little North Korean marketplaces, such as they were, but not the food. Now, apparently, like, first of all, they distribute stuff that no one would voluntarily eat. It's kind of disgusting, like porridge-like, and it's deliberately made unpalatable. And that is the big, like, when you think about that they have to give people gross food because otherwise it'll get stolen. But also, they monitor the distribution. So the food's actually going to people. But this is, the kids are something like 4 or 5 inches shorter than their South Korean counterparts. It's just, and then it's just going on. You still kind of have to hope for reunification, just because you can't imagine another alternative in which those kids get enough to eat.
On that depressing note, with I guess like a very thin tinge of optimism.
Peace on earth, goodwill towards men. I guess it's terrible to read about, but I guess we won't know for a while. But
well, it's been great doing this with you.
Yes.
I'm sorry. I've missed basically almost the entire final year of the Blogging Heads era, but I'm glad I was able to get one in under the wire, and appreciate the back and forth with you.
And me as well. Farewell, Internet.
Yeah, that's it. Well, thanks again.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right, take care.